Thursday, August 31st, 2023, AGNDD Intellireport topic: 1989 Tiananmen Square protests and massacre. Please pardon any visual and informational inaccuracies in this entirely AI-generated Wikipedia-sourced video article.
In this text, we explore the different names used to describe the events of 1989 in China, commonly known as the Tiananmen Square massacre, and the historical context leading up to it. The Chinese government has used various names to describe the events of 1989, including counter-revolutionary rebellion, riot, political turmoil, and 1989 storm. Outside of mainland China, the crackdown is commonly referred to as the June 4th massacre or June 4th crackdown. To bypass censorship, alternative names such as May 35th, Veitor, 8 squared, and 8,964 inches have emerged online. In English, terms like Tiananmen Square massacre, Tiananmen Square protests, and Tiananmen Square crackdown are often used, although the violence extended beyond Tiananmen Square and occurred in multiple cities across China. The Cultural Revolution led by Mao Zedong concluded in 1976 with his demise and the apprehension of the Gang of Four. It inflicted substantial harm on China's economy and society, resulting in poverty and a concentration on political ideology. In 1977, Deng Xiaoping put forward the notion of bringing order out of chaos to rectify the errors of the Cultural Revolution. Deng emerged as China's de facto leader in 1978 and initiated economic reforms to attain material prosperity. Deng elevated his supporters, such as Zhao Ziyang and Hu Yaobang, to prominent government and party positions. Deng's reforms aimed to decrease the state's role in the economy and allow private production. However, concerns grew over corruption and nepotism, as well as the two-tier pricing system that allowed some to profit from price fluctuations. Discontent over corruption led many to believe that democratic reform and the rule of law were needed. The government attempted to implement a market-based pricing system but quickly rescinded it, leading to inflation and panic among workers. The pressure to cut costs also threatened social benefits for many. In 1978, reformist leaders hoped that intellectuals would guide the country through reforms, but this did not happen as planned. The education system did not produce enough graduates to meet demand, and job opportunities were limited. Private companies no longer had to accept state-assigned students, leading to nepotism and favoritism in hiring. Intellectuals and students became more politically involved, forming study groups. The party's socialist ideology faced a legitimacy crisis as capitalism grew, causing discontent over wealth distribution. The reformers and conservatives within the leadership had differing views on marketization and control over ideology, requiring the support of Deng Xiaoping to make important decisions. In mid-1986, astrophysics professor Fang Liji toured universities in China advocating for political reform and criticizing the authoritarian system. His speeches gained widespread appeal among students, leading to protests in December 1986. The central leadership accused the students of instigating turmoil and blamed General Secretary Hu Yaobang for mishandling the situation. Hu was forced to resign, and an anti-bourgeois liberalization campaign was launched to suppress political activity. Despite this, Hu remained popular among intellectuals, students, and progressive members of the Communist Party. On August 18, 1980, Deng Xiaoping delivered a speech advocating for political reforms in China. He criticized bureaucracy, centralization of power, and patriarchy, and proposed term limits for leading positions. In December 1982, the current Constitution of China was enacted. In 1986, Deng called for the reinvigoration of political reforms to tackle corruption and economic inequality. A committee was formed to examine the feasibility of political reform. Deng aimed to enhance administrative efficiency, separate party and government responsibilities, and eliminate bureaucracy. However, he opposed Western-style constitutionalism. At the 1987 CCP Congress, Zhao Ziyang outlined measures for political reform, including promoting the rule of law and separation of powers. During the Hong Kong protests, protesters received support from various sources, including the Chinese University in Hong Kong and groups like the Hong Kong Alliance in support of patriotic democratic movements of China. Donations also came from countries such as the United States, Canada, Japan, Taiwan, Australia, and Europe. The CIA and MI6 reportedly aided the student activists by providing equipment and organizing the smuggling of dissident leaders out of Hong Kong. The death of Hu Yaobang in April 1989 sparked student protests in China. Initially, students gathered to mourn Hu's death and honor his legacy, but the protests soon expanded to address broader political issues such as corruption, democracy, and freedom of the press. The protests grew in size and intensity, with students drafting a list of demands for the government. The protests culminated in a large march to Tiananmen Square and clashes with the police. The funeral of Hu Yaobang further fueled the protests, with thousands of students marching on Tiananmen Square despite orders to close it. On the 22nd of April, riots broke out in Changsha and Xi'an, with arson, looting, and destruction of property occurring in both cities. Over 350 people were arrested for looting. In Wuhan, university students organized protests against the provincial government. Zhao Ziyang, the General Secretary of the Communist Party, called for discouraging further protests, combating rioting, and opening dialogue with students. Premier Li Peng disagreed and called for more serious action. Despite calls for him to stay, Zhao left for a state visit to North Korea on the 23rd of April. After Zhao Ziyang's departure, Li Peng became the acting executive authority in Beijing. On April 24th, Li Peng and the PSC met with municipal officials to discuss the situation at Tiananmen Square. The officials framed the protests as a conspiracy to overthrow the political system and party leaders. In Zhao's absence, the PSC agreed to take firm action against the protesters. Deng Xiaoping endorsed a hardline stance, and a communique was issued to mobilize the party apparatus against the protesters. The People's Daily issued an editorial branding the student movement as anti-party and anti-government, which enraged the students and further polarized the situation. On April 27th, tens of thousands of students from Beijing universities marched through the streets to Tiananmen Square, receiving public support. The student leaders toned down anti-communist slogans and focused on anti-corruption and pro-party messages. The march forced the government to make concessions and meet with student representatives, but the talks achieved few results. The government's tone became more conciliatory when Zhao Ziyang returned and delivered sympathetic speeches. On May 4th, most Beijing universities announced the end of the classroom boycott, and student interest in the movement waned. In mid-April, the government was divided on how to respond to the movement. Tensions between the progressive and conservative camps intensified after Zhao Ziyang's return from North Korea. Supporters of dialogue and a soft approach rallied behind Zhao, while hardliner conservatives opposed the movement and supported Premier Li Peng. Zhao and Li clashed at a meeting, with Li prioritizing stability and Zhao advocating for increased democracy. The movement faced internal discord and declining engagement from students. Some leaders, including Wang Dan and Wu Erkaishi, called for more confrontational tactics and organized a hunger strike starting on the 13th of May. On May 13th, students in Beijing began a hunger strike to pressure the government into meeting their demands. The hunger strike gained widespread sympathy and support from the population. Inspired by the events in Beijing, protests and strikes started at universities in other cities, with students traveling to Beijing to join the demonstration. The Tiananmen Square demonstration was well organized, with daily marches and the singing of socialist anthems. However, fearing the movement would escalate, Deng Xiaoping ordered the square to be cleared for Mikhail Gorbachev's visit. This announcement caused disarray among the student leadership. In May, press restrictions were loosened, allowing state media to broadcast sympathetic footage of the protests. Intellectuals gained permission to air their progressive views in Guangming Daily and urged the students to leave the square. Negotiations between government and student representatives took place, but chaos ensued as different student factions relayed conflicting demands. The meeting fell apart when it was not broadcast nationally. Government Representative Yan Mingfu personally appealed to the students, but Li Peng refused to retract the 26th of April editorial. The student movement disrupted the Sino-Soviet summit, embarrassing the leadership. Zhao's remark about Deng being the paramount authority caused a split between the country's two senior leaders. The hunger strikes during the student protests in Beijing garnered widespread support and sympathy across the country. Around 1 million residents, including military personnel, police officers, and party officials, demonstrated in solidarity. Grassroots organizations, labor unions, and non-communist parties also expressed support. Foreign journalists continued to cover the protests, putting international pressure on the Chinese government. The movement gained momentum as students from all over the country joined in, leading to protests in hundreds of cities. The government was divided on how to respond, and martial law was discussed as a possible solution. Deng Xiaoping ultimately made the decision to impose martial law, with some members of the Politburo Standing Committee opposing it. Zhao Ziyang announced his refusal to carry out martial law and eventually took leave. Student leaders were closely monitored by authorities through surveillance measures such as traffic cameras and wiretapping at gathering places. This surveillance helped the government identify and punish participants of the protest. Following the massacre, extensive interrogations were conducted at various locations to determine the individuals who had taken part in the protest. On April 19th, the World Economic Herald published a special section dedicated to Hu Yaobang. It featured an article written by Yan Jiaqi, which expressed support for the student protests in Beijing. However, Jiang Zemin, sensing a rise in conservative political sentiments, ordered the censorship of the article. As a result, many newspapers had blank pages in place of the censored content. Jiang's actions received praise from Conservative Party elders. On May 27th, more than 300,000 individuals gathered in Hong Kong for a concert for democracy in China. The following day, a procession of 1.5 million people took place. These events were part of widespread protests that occurred globally. Many governments issued travel warnings against visiting China in response to the situation. In May 1989, the Chinese government declared martial law and mobilized military divisions to suppress the protests in Beijing. However, the army's first entry into the capital was blocked by protesters, resulting in a temporary withdrawal. Meanwhile, the student movement became disorganized and divided, lacking clear leadership or a unified plan of action. Internal conflicts and power struggles arose within the student groups, with allegations of collusion and efforts to remove leaders. The situation in Tiananmen Square became overcrowded and unsanitary. On the 1st of June, Li Peng circulated a report titled, "On the True Nature of the Turmoil" to all members of the Politburo. The report claims that the leaders of the demonstrators were responsible for organizing and plotting the turmoil, using the square as a base to provoke conflict for international attention. It also alleges that they had connections with criminals and received funding to improve their communication and acquire weapons. The report recommends the Chinese government to swiftly suppress the counter-revolutionary turmoil in Beijing. A report by Ministry of State Security Chief Jia Chunwang, submitted to the party leadership, accuses the United States of ideological and political infiltration into China. The report claims that a U.S. embassy official met with protesters regularly and alleges that the U.S. State Department attempted to build a counter-revolutionary armed force in China. It also accuses American students and journalists of fueling the protests and offering asylum or assistance to protest leaders. The report advocates for military action and blames the United States for the protests and turmoil in China. On June 2, 1989, the Chinese government made the decision to take action and clear Tiananmen Square of protesters. The government published articles urging the students to vacate the square, which greatly angered the students and resulted in additional protests. 3 intellectuals and a Taiwanese singer initiated a hunger strike to reinvigorate the movement. The government agreed to peacefully clear the square if possible, but also authorized the use of force if necessary. Troops were strategically positioned in important areas of the city, and tensions escalated even further when a military vehicle incidentally ran over pedestrians. Students and citizens intercepted and interrogated soldiers, and some individuals were even abducted. On the evening of June 3rd, the government issued an emergency announcement advising people to avoid Tiananmen Square. However, this warning was not heeded, as similar announcements had been made before. At the same time, protesters used university campuses in Beijing to broadcast their own messages, urging students and citizens to gather at intersections and Tiananmen Square, armed if necessary. On June 3rd, the 38th Army, led by Interim Commander Zhang Meiwan, attempted to advance towards Tiananmen Square in Beijing. They encountered a blockade set up by protesters, and clashes broke out. Troops used rubber bullets and tear gas while protesters threw rocks and bottles. Warning shots were fired into the air, but when the protesters didn't disperse, the army officer ordered the use of force. Infantrymen fired into the air and pointed their weapons at the crowd. At around 10:30 in the evening, the 38th Army troops in Beijing initiated gunfire against protesters who were hurling rocks at them. The troops employed live ammunition and APCs to dismantle the barricades established by the protesters, leading to casualties among civilians. The protesters were taken aback by the deployment of force and withdrew towards Muxidi Bridge. The army persisted in advancing, utilizing expanding bullets and engaging in indiscriminate firing towards both protesters and bystanders. The greatest number of fatalities took place between Muxidi and Zidan, where multiple military vehicles were annihilated or impaired. Chai Ling, a student leader during the Tiananmen Square protests, expressed a willingness for the movement to end in violence, hoping for a violent crackdown by the government to awaken the people of China. However, she was unable to convince her fellow students of this approach. During the protests, demonstrators attacked troops with various weapons, including poles, rocks, and Molotov cocktails. They also set fire to military vehicles and beat soldiers to death. The violence escalated, with soldiers being attacked and killed by angry mobs. These incidents were captured on camera and broadcast by Chinese state television. Cables from the U.S. Embassy in Beijing described the events of the Tiananmen Square clearance operation on June 4, 1989. The cables state that columns of military vehicles entered Tiananmen Square, and PLA troops opened fire on demonstrators, causing casualties. The violence continued throughout the day, with eyewitnesses reporting tanks running over people and soldiers attacking civilians. The cables also mention that some soldiers were attacked by the crowd before the shooting began. The government issued an announcement urging citizens and students to evacuate the square. During the Tiananmen Square massacre, many soldiers in the People's Liberation Army refused to follow orders to enforce martial law. Some soldiers were hesitant to turn their weapons on the students, feeling conflicted and believing that the PLA should fight for the people, not against them. Bystanders and protesters reminded them of this sentiment. Beijing police officers also defended citizens and used their weapons against the incoming soldiers, according to popular accounts. On June 5th, the military regained control over Beijing's streets, including Chang'an Avenue. A video captured a lone protester standing in front of a column of tanks on the avenue. The man was later pulled aside by a group of people with differing opinions on whether they were government agents or concerned bystanders. The fate of the protester, known as Tank Man, remains unknown. The government regained control in the following week, leading to a political purge and the imprisonment of protest leaders. After the Tiananmen Square massacre in Beijing on June 4th, protests persisted in other Chinese cities, including Hong Kong. In Shanghai, students obstructed roads and railways, resulting in confrontations with the government. In cities like Xi'an, Wuhan, Nanjing, and Chengdu, students erected roadblocks and disrupted train services. They also encouraged workers to participate in strikes. The atmosphere in Wuhan grew tense, leading residents to engage in panic buying and bank runs. However, the municipal government in Shanghai received commendation for preventing a significant disruption. At a news conference, State Council spokesperson Yuan Mu announced that approximately 300 individuals lost their lives during the Tiananmen Square protests. This included soldiers, students, and individuals who were considered deserving of such consequences due to their crimes. Additionally, thousands of police officers, soldiers, and civilians sustained injuries. Military spokesperson Zhang Gong refuted claims of any fatalities occurring in Tiananmen Square or individuals being run over by tanks. Deng Xiaoping, in his initial public appearance since the protests commenced, commended the soldiers who perished and accused the protesters of attempting to overthrow the party and establish a Western-dependent bourgeois republic. The exact number of deaths and level of violence during the events in the square are still debated. The government initially tried to suppress information about casualties, so estimates rely on eyewitness accounts, hospital records, and efforts by victims' families. This has led to significant discrepancies in casualty figures, with initial estimates ranging from a few hundred to several thousand. According to official government announcements, the initial death toll from the event was around 300, including civilians, soldiers, and students. The government later confirmed a death toll of 241, including civilians, soldiers, and armed police, with around 7,000 wounded. The number of injured was estimated to be around 6,000 by the mayor. On the morning of June 4th, various estimates of the death toll during the Tiananmen Square protests were reported. Peking University leaflets suggested a death toll of 2,000 to 3,000, while the Chinese Red Cross initially stated 2,600 deaths but later denied it. The Swiss ambassador estimated 2,700 deaths, and the New York Times suggested around a dozen soldiers and 400 to 800 civilians were killed. The United States ambassador believed several hundred were killed, and a declassified NSA cable estimated 180 to 500 deaths. Beijing hospital records recorded at least 478 dead and 920 wounded. Amnesty International and a Western diplomat estimated several hundred to close to 1,000 deaths. British Ambassador Alan Donald initially claimed 10,000 civilian deaths, but later revised it to 2,700 to 3,400 deaths. The Tiananmen Mothers, a victims advocacy group, has identified 202 victims of the Tiananmen Square crackdown as of August 2011. Despite government interference, the group has worked diligently to locate victims' families and gather information. The list includes 4 individuals who committed suicide due to their involvement in the demonstrations. Wu Renhua, a former protester, claims that only 15 military deaths can be verified, and if deaths unrelated to the demonstrators are excluded, only 7 deaths among military personnel can be attributed to rioters. Government officials have denied that anyone died in Tiananmen Square during the 1989 protests, but Chinese scholar Wu Renhua argues that the location of the killings is irrelevant. Historian Rowena He agrees, stating that the central issue is the widespread state violence in Beijing. Some foreign journalists have acknowledged that most deaths occurred outside the square. The Tiananmen Mothers Group records 3 student deaths in the square, while student leader Chai Ling claims between 200 and 4,000 deaths. However, there is conflicting evidence and accounts of what happened that night. U.S. Embassy cables from 2011 also suggest that the bloodshed occurred outside the square. On June 13, 1989, the Beijing Public Security Bureau issued an arrest order for 21 student leaders who were involved in the Tiananmen Square protests. These leaders were members of the Beijing Students' Autonomous Federation, and their faces and descriptions were televised. Some leaders were able to flee to Western countries through Operation Yellowbird, while others were captured and imprisoned. As of 2012, only 2 individuals are still in custody, and it is believed that Miao Deshun is the last known prisoner from the protests. All remaining prisoners are said to suffer from mental illnesses. After the Tiananmen Square massacre, the Chinese Communist Party leadership took various actions to consolidate their power and suppress dissent. Zhao Ziyang and Hu Qili were expelled from the Politburo Standing Committee, while Wan Li was put under house arrest. Jiang Zemin was promoted to General Secretary of the Communist Party. Deng Xiaoping officially resigned from his leadership positions. Diplomatic cables revealed that members of the Politburo Standing Committee approached the Swiss ambassador to transfer money to Swiss bank accounts. Bao Tong, Zhao Ziyang's aide, was charged and convicted, while a rectification program was initiated to purge sympathizers of the protests from the party. Tens of thousands of people were arrested, imprisoned, and subjected to torture. The Chinese Communist Party's official narrative on the 4th of June incident justifies the use of force as necessary to control political turmoil and maintain stability for economic development. Chinese leaders consistently reiterated this narrative when questioned by foreign journalists, and print media were required to align with the government's account. The Chinese government released a white paper explaining its views on the protests, but the Tiananmen papers were later published anonymously, revealing different perspectives. At the 30th anniversary, a Chinese general stated that the government's decisive measures brought stability and facilitated China's transformation under Communist Party leadership. The suppression of the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989 marked the end of press freedom in China. Media workers faced restrictions and punishment, with some being fired for sympathizing with the protesters. However, in the years that followed, restrictions loosened and privately run print media flourished. State-approved religious organizations grew, allowing for the re-emergence of traditional beliefs. The state also used certain religious groups to combat controversial movements like Falun Gong. During the imposition of martial law in China, the government cut off satellite transmissions from Western broadcasters. However, some broadcasters were still able to report using telephones and smuggled out video footage. Television Española of Spain was the only network that managed to record video during the night of June 4th. Foreign journalists experienced harassment, and some were even detained. Journalists who covered the crackdown were either expelled or blacklisted, and there were reports of them being beaten. There were also allegations that Western outlets deliberately withheld certain images from viewers. The Chinese government's response to the Tiananmen Square protests was heavily criticized by the West, some members of the Eastern Bloc, Asian and Latin American countries, and the Chinese diaspora. Numerous foreign governments expressed strong disapproval of the crackdown. leading Western countries to implement punitive measures and Eastern European countries to question China's socialist reform credentials. Asian countries, for the most part, remained relatively silent on the issue, with India minimizing media coverage to preserve its relations with China. The Communist Party of India, Marxist, stood as the sole political party to support the crackdown. On the other hand, Cuba, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany showed their support for China, while Hungary, Poland, and Yugoslavia backed the protests. The Soviet Union privately held a critical stance, despite publicly expressing hope for continued reform. The party shifted its focus from orthodox communism to nationalism, which helped regain public support. The protests revealed shortcomings in riot control equipment and training for the Chinese military and police. The PLA and PAP units were ill-prepared to handle riots, but efforts were made to improve riot control units after the massacre. The belief that the lack of sophisticated riot control techniques contributed to the massacre is considered a myth, as the Communist Party wanted to instill fear in the country. After the Tiananmen Square protests, China faced economic repercussions such as downgraded outlooks, decreased aid and investment, and lowered credit ratings. However, government defense spending increased, and the government attempted to centralize control over the economy. Deng Xiaoping's southern tour in 1992 advocated for further economic reforms, leading to market liberalization on a larger scale. The economic shocks of 1989 had only a temporary effect as China's economy regained momentum in the 1990s. The Tiananmen Square protests in 1989 had a significant impact on Hong Kong, leading to fears about China's commitment to the one country, two systems principle. Governor Chris Patten's attempts to expand the franchise for the Legislative Council of Hong Kong created tension with Beijing. The event eroded trust in the Beijing government among Hong Kongers and contributed to a significant exodus of people from Hong Kong to Western countries. Candlelight vigils have been held in Hong Kong every year since 1989, but the June 4th Museum, dedicated to the events, closed in 2016, and a virtual version has been blocked by Chinese telecom companies. The events of June 4th continue to shape perceptions of China, its government, and attitudes towards democracy in Hong Kong. After the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989, China faced international condemnation and became isolated. However, the government continued its economic liberalization policies and worked to reshape its image as a global partner. The crackdown had little impact on China's relations with its Asian neighbors, as many countries had similar human rights records. China also expanded its international partnerships, joined various international organizations, and attracted foreign investment. Western leaders, while acknowledging the Tiananmen legacy, often prioritized business and trade interests in their discussions with China. The European Union and United States have maintained an embargo on armament sales to China since the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989. China has been pushing for the ban to be lifted, but has faced opposition from various EU members. Efforts to lift the ban in 2004 were hindered by tensions between China and Taiwan, and subsequent support for lifting the ban waned. The European Parliament has consistently opposed lifting the embargo, while the U.S. Congress has proposed restrictions on military technology transferred to the EU if the ban is lifted. The Chinese government actively suppresses discussions and information about the Tiananmen Square protests. They block or censor related content, ban controversial films and books, and shut down newspapers. Access to media and internet resources about the protests is restricted or blocked. Print media must align with the government's version of events, and journalists, both domestic and foreign, are detained or harassed. Public discussions about the events are socially taboo, but private discussions still occur despite interference from authorities. The government mobilizes security forces to prevent public displays of remembrance on the anniversary of the protests. Zhang Shijun, a former soldier who participated in the Tiananmen Square protests, penned a letter to President Hu Jintao, urging the government to reconsider its position on the events. As a result, he was later apprehended. In 2005, the Chinese government provided compensation to Tang Daying, the mother of a victim, marking the initial instance of acknowledgement and reparation for a family affected by the Tiananmen tragedy. Tang Daying received CNY 70,000, equivalent to approximately $10,250, a development that was viewed as a favorable stride by Chinese activists. Before his death, Yang Shangkun admitted that the events of June 4, 1989 were a grave mistake by the Communist Party, but one that he couldn't rectify. Zhao Ziyang, who was under house arrest until his death, had his aide Bao Tong calling for the government to reconsider its stance on the Tiananmen Square protests. Chen Shitong, the former mayor of Beijing, expressed regret for the loss of innocent lives. Premier Wen Jiabao also reportedly suggested a reversal of the government's position, but was rejected by his colleagues. During the 41st session of the UN Committee Against Torture in 2008, concerns were raised about the lack of investigations into the events surrounding the Beijing suppression in June 1989. The Chinese government was criticized for not informing the relatives of those affected and for not holding those responsible for excessive force accountable. The committee recommended that the Chinese government apologize, provide reparations, and prosecute those responsible. In response, the Chinese government closed the case, stating that their actions at the time were necessary and correct, and that the incident was not accurately labeled as a democracy movement. In conclusion, the Chinese government has used various names to describe the events of 1989, while outside of mainland China, alternative names have emerged to bypass censorship. The Cultural Revolution caused significant damage, but Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms brought about material prosperity.
Hope you enjoyed this AGNDD Intellireport. Like, subscribe, and click the bell button to get notified during new uploads, and make sure to tune in next time. Stay safe and healthy. Cheers.